Hello everybody, and welcome to today's webinar, which is called Cyber Resilience Through Attacker Deception: What Contractors Need to Know for CMMC Compliance. I hope that wherever you are right now, you and your families are safe and healthy. My name is Daniel Brody, Product Marketing Director at Illusive Networks, and I will be today's moderator. Before we get the webinar started, I wanted to mention a few housekeeping items. First, today's webinar will be available on demand after the live session and will be accessible at elusivenetworks.com. We'll email you a link after the session. Also, we would love to hear from our viewers during today's presentation. So if you have a question for the speaker, or both speakers actually, please feel free to send it along through the Q&A box on the Zoom player. And you can also tweet at us at our Twitter handle at ElusiveNW, that is at ElusiveNW. We'll answer questions at the end of the session, and if we don't have time to get to yours, we'll definitely make sure to follow up afterwards. So, without any further ado, let's kick things off. How are you doing, Mike?
Great. Happy to have the opportunity to share the details today.
All right. Well, let's get things started then. The floor is yours.
Thank you, sir. Hey, so we'll go over the agenda. We're going to do a quick tour of CMMC, just cover the drivers for the mandate and the applicability. We're also going to dive a bit deeper into the cyber resilience concepts that apply to APTs and that alignment with the elusive capabilities. And at the end of the session here, Mr. Tomlin will be providing a brief demo as well. So, the premise with CMMC is obviously the DoD supply chain is under attack. There's a pretty long history of some of the more significant breaches that have happened, and some of the more recent ones as well. But systematically, the third-party infrastructure is being targeted by nation states, by malicious actors, to gain access to confidential data that's not on classified networks, like the intellectual property and designs on some of the weapon systems. And whether it's through the subcontractor infrastructure or it's through the education research network partnership, those edges are being focused on and attacked. Therefore, the DoD is asking their supply chain participants to increase their security to meet DoD standards. Recent content has, come together through years of thought work. Most recently manifested with the NIST 800-160 Volume 2, which was published in November of 19, and that really does lay the foundation of the concept of cyber resilience, because we have primary effects in place today, the traditional security approaches, but now we need to make those more resilient and redundant, particularly in regards to advanced persistent threats. The key topic we're talking about today is the Cybersecurity Maturity Model and where the cyber resiliency capabilities fit in, particularly in the level 4 and level 5 compliance areas, and as well as the additional requirements now that are coming out more from the federal civilian agencies underneath the Department of Homeland Security programs, such as Trusted Internet Connection, that also require cyber resilience functionalities. That does include deception, which we'll be talking about today, but it also does include things like high value asset protection and lateral movement prevention. So when we're looking at cyber resiliency, to obtain that level 5 certification, deception is definitely required to protect against advanced persistent threats. When we're looking into the concept of secondary effects, that level 5 compliance does bring in other concepts, and we're differentiating now in cyber resilience design techniques, of which deception is a technique, versus cyber resilience design principles, which attack surface reduction and critical asset or high value asset identification and protection are requirements as well. And within that, we're looking at the system and communication control class. We're looking at the system and information and integrity control classes, as well as audit and accountability, situational awareness, and incident response. To get to those higher levels, which any supplier that wants to compete for DoD business and remain in standing to retain existing contracts, that's really the impetus of the program. What's interesting is the visual really shows that attackers will take the easiest route, and they will focus on upgrading privilege, that lateral movement activity, and identifying, where are the valuable assets they want to get to. They need privilege to do that. They need to identify where there's high concentration of resources, therefore more accounts, more credentials, more connections to leverage to get around all the existing security controls. And when we look at deception in general, as it's called out in 800-160 Volume 2, as well as the applicability of the newer NIST 853 Rev 5 controls. The references we're showing here for deception, SC 26 does call for decoys. The decoy concept can be the things known traditionally as honeypots or honey nets. That also includes the concepts for deception for detection with the breadcrumbing or honey token approach. But there's also misdirection and tainting. Misdirection is really covered in the SC 30 control, concealment and misdirection, and this does call for creating deceptive networks that mimic actual aspects of the organizational systems. And finally, tainting in SI 20 calls for having capability to identify that data has been exfiltrated or data has been improperly removed from the systems. The detection of that is, the aspect of that control we're focused on. So it's interesting, the attack surface today is definitely, changing and transforming beyond the traditional data center to the vertical movement now between the data center and the cloud, as well as the, cloud to cloud, intranet and extranet facing cloud capabilities. So there's not just lateral movement to protect from, but vertical and cloud as well. We look at the Elusive Platform, in the demo today, Mr. Tomlin will focus on some of our application functionalities around attack surface management. That's that preemptive motion in our life cycle, as well as attack detection system, which is where we're laying out the deceptive decoy detection layer, as well as what we're doing on the response side when we're getting alerts and we're able to pull forensics. Ultimately, the approach we're taking to implement deception covers, a broader baseline than just those few controls, which we'll talk about here in a moment. But the goal here is to really have high quality detections and do it in a low maintenance and scalable approach that integrates with existing processes. Not going to cover all the details on this slide, but when we look at the full ecosystem of integrating with security operations, having different deceptive artifact and low to medium to high interaction environments, that's part of the capability that Elusive's providing to line up with that deception requirement, but also the the ability to reduce the exploits around credentials and connections that enable lateral movement and privileged upgrade attack vectors. That's all part of the solution ecosystem, which we'll talk more about here in a few minutes. When we're looking at the control coverage for specifically for level 5 in CMMC for advanced persistent threat protection, we are covering 15 of the 25 critical controls. We could be more liberal in our interpretation and maybe claim more, but I think these are, vetted that these implementations do cover, these control areas. We do have a technical brief that's available that gets into more detail on the specifics of application functionality and controls. And similarly, again, the concept of the periodic table is, from the NIST DHS publication. And in this aspect of high value asset protection and lateral movement prevention, we're covering 19 of the 44 critical controls. Again, that attack surface reduction really is focused on the access control and audit and incident response side of the control mapping. So, at the end of the day, we want to deploy deception and attack surface reduction in the most effective manner. It's not just about having places for attackers to go. It's about making the endpoint the sensor through the concept of deceptive artifacts that attackers have to trip on to move. And we'll talk more about that philosophy on how we create that landscape. But identifying not only the first move, but the second move attempt, we're looking at 99% effectiveness of catching that privilege upgrade move that malicious actors have to take to accomplish their goals. Again, adversaries look at the environment to see what they need to defeat before they move. In our context, we are agentless and really undiscoverable. That's why we win red team exercises, as well as external pen tests and even the adversarial scenarios that we're constantly detecting in our deployments. And again, that leads to really 100% positive alerts and detections. And that's really the summary we wanted to cover before going into the demo and turning it over to Mr. Tomlin.
All right, thanks, Mike. Appreciate it. So, yeah, I mean, starting off with a theme that Mike had earlier, relative to the principle of the attack surface management, is all about, or is integral to, the concept of cyber resiliency, right? So, when we look at the attacker view, we look at the world the same way an attacker does. So if an attacker lands on an endpoint, they're going to see the connections that are available from that endpoint. They don't see the whole network in a nice, pretty Visio diagram. So as a result, they have a very myopic view of the world. And they're going to leverage this to be able to move to one of these different endpoints, and using that privilege upgrade potentially, or, the credentials that they've already acquired, to be able to do that. So what we're doing first and foremost is we're going out to all the endpoints on the environment, and we're getting that attacker level view. How does what is on these different endpoints that the attacker can leverage to live off the land? And we use that data to be able to construct the concept of a pathway to a high value asset, or crown jewel, as we call it. So whether it's your domain controller, whether it is, maybe it's the first floor HVAC system in this environment, but also, the ability to target highly privileged groups in the environment. Those also need to be protected. So we're watching those, in that level of view. And here we're going to help understand what different endpoints have a connection to the crown jewel in question, in this case, our domain controller. So we've got 3 different endpoints here, but if I move this out to 2, 3, 4, 5 hops, now I've got a bigger viewpoint of the network that I'm in, and I can see the different connections that are cached on these endpoints. These represent the information that an attacker is going to use to live off the land. So we want to be aware of this. And here we'll see, Win10 has a connection that's cached for RDP to Computer 10. Computer 10 has a connection that's cached up to Computer 7. Computer 7 has a connection over here to the HVAC system, which has a connection to my domain controller. So there's a nice simple path that an attacker can exploit across the network to be able to get to that high value asset. So first and foremost, we want to identify that this exists, because if you can't see it, then you can't stop it. So first and foremost, I want to see this, and then I want to take some action. So I want to remediate this and actually go in and say, okay, we're going to clear out those violating paths. So the system will actually go in using the self-dissolving executable that Mike mentioned earlier, and it will clean up the attack surface, reduce the attack surface by removing the different connections that we were able to identify in the environment. So that's first and foremost, basically bring hygiene to the environment, but then also be able to do this regularly. So, effectively continuous monitoring, continuous cleanup, because ultimately these connections are, they're not malicious. They are the byproduct of normal operation, in the environment. So as a result, after we've done this cleanup, there will be new connections formed during the process. Now, the second thing we're going to do then is we're going to make this difficult for the attacker. And we're going to do that with deception. So we're going to distort the attacker's reality and effectively bring in a deceptive environment so that now we've overloaded their viewpoint. So everything in orange on this map here is deceptive in nature. So deceptive connections, deceptive credentials. And if we go back and look at Win 10 again, now we can see that it has 6 different deceptive connections that have all been planted on that environment. So it allows us to then distort the reality for the attacker. And now the attacker, when they come in, they're going to be looking at these connections as potential places to move to gain more data, to gain more access in the network. So while we see it as administrators, we see everything here as orange, indicating that it's deceptive. What the attacker sees is, the actual connections. So they'll see 2 SSH connections, they'll see a share connection, they'll see 3 RDP connections based on the color coding. So in their world, we're effectively telling them a very convincing story that these connections have been made by 1 or more users on this endpoint. And they see this, and then they're the ones that now have to make a decision on whether or not they move, which one of these things they move to. And when they do, that's when the detection happens. So we're able to detect the fact that they moved. So when they make that move, the system is aware of that and will generate an alert here, an incident that indicates that something has happened relative to the deception. So in this case, there were 2 deceptions that were triggered. One, they attempted to connect to one of our deceptive shares, and you see down here they were going to create a file. And then in the second one here, they were attempting to RDP to one of the deceptive servers, and that triggered the incident as well. Now, when we have an incident that gets created, the system also fires a second executable. It's a self-dissolving executable similar to the one that does the analysis, and this one gathers forensics about the endpoint. So the idea here is that not only do we detect the fact that somebody attempted to connect, but now we gather a bunch of details about that endpoint to assist with the incident response to this. And it's everything from a general analysis that floor 17 win 10 attempted to connect. The target was hr.elusive.ng. And what did they attempt to do? They attempted to create a file on a shared folder. But then we also get more detailed information. We can see that it's, the system information here. It's a Windows 10 workstation. The user logged in was user 3. We can go in and see, connection information, network connections in the environment. We can see their, the DNS records that they've pulled down, running services. We can see, the information from the prefetch cache. So I can see what's run in that environment. I can see here they ran evil.exe, and then they ran further down here. You can see they ran Mimikatz. So here we can see we have evidence that they've run an attack tool that's used to harvest credentials out of the Windows LSAS cache. So we can see that detail, and even more so if we look at the desktop screenshot that we gathered. Now I can see here in the right-hand window, they ran Mimikatz, they harvested credentials, and then the credential that they harvest, they go over to the left-hand window and they attempt to connect to one of the servers using those harvested credentials. So we have a lot of information about the attack that's playing out, whether it's an insider attack, whether it's a compromised endpoint. All of this assists the incident responders in terms of how they react to the detected lateral movement. We also bring in something called a forensics timeline, and this basically gives that that SOC analyst, that incident analyst, some additional detail, and it does it in a reverse chronological order here. So now we can see here's the events that were triggered, that triggered the creation of the incident, and now I can walk down and see what was going on that system prior to that. So I see some some network connections that were going out that may be out to command and control, especially this one here. It was evil.exe is making that connection. But then as I come down further, I'm able to see here's some DNS queries that were happening. They were looking for the Active Directory. And then right before that, here's the execution of Mimikatz. So now I can see that they were, in fact, actually running that, and they ran it right before the incident was triggered, therefore indicating that they most likely grabbed that those credentials that they were harvesting and then immediately attempted to make the connection right after that. So Daniel, that's all I had.
All right. Thank you for that, Rick. And it looks like we have some questions coming in. So I guess let's start the Q&A. Just a reminder, you can also type your questions in now, if you haven't asked them yet, into the question box in the Zoom control panel. So first question coming up, how do you create the fake content in your deceptions?
Yeah, so it's interesting because that is deceptive content is really created using a variety of techniques, and they're all tailored to the environment that Elusive is operating in. So in that we will create server names based on what we see other server names in the environment using for a naming convention. We will use real and deceptive user IDs. Again, based on the user IDs we see in the environment. So the idea is that, it tells a really good story because it looks like what's actually there, the real IDs, the real server names. But it also makes it so that no two environments that Elusive is operating in are alike. And that makes it very difficult for an attacker to pattern, what it sees in Elusive, to be able to see a pattern that is used across different environments, to be able to detect that Elusive is actually running in that environment.
All right, great. Next question here, can deception scale to hundreds of thousands of endpoints in multi-geography environments?
Oh, excellent question. So, yeah, I mean, the reality is that you have, in order to get that kind of scale, there has to be an intentional architecture behind it, and the product has to be architected that way from day one. So Elusive is architected with that scale in mind. Not only can a single management server, handle well over 100,000 endpoints, but because we are, our deceptions are very small bits of data, effectively breadcrumbs, using the older term for this, that are placed on each of the endpoints, we effectively are taking those endpoints and turning them into the sensors on the network. So we, and that's as opposed to requiring a heavy lift of, large architecture and large amounts of physical infrastructure, in order to do so with other solutions.
All right. Next question here. Do you use an agent to deploy the deceptions?
No, actually we do not. We have a self-dissolving executable that is deployed by default. It's every 20 hours. But as I mentioned earlier, that's important that it is being deployed on a regular basis. But it is an executable that is deployed, runs in about 300 milliseconds, give or take, and then self-dissolves. It's not installed on the environment. It's not an agent on the environment. There's no disk footprint. There's nothing there for, to tip the hand to the attacker that there are deceptions in play. And that's important because, as Mike said earlier, the first thing that an attacker does when they land on a system is they introspect that system. They want to know everything about that system. Is it real? Is it a VM? What kind of hardware is it running? Does that match up with what they would expect for that class of environment? Are there agents they need to defeat, et cetera? So they're seeing all that, they're doing all that right up front to understand, where they've landed.
Okay, we're coming up at the top of the hour here, so I guess we'll fit in one more question. Someone here writes, I already have an IAM platform. Doesn't that make your attack surface management redundant?
So first of all, it's good that people have IAM. I mean, identity management is extremely important. But again, it's only focused on identity. It's only focused on credential management, in the environment. What ASM is really doing is looking at connection and credential information, and giving you that viewpoint from the attacker point of view. So not the well-structured IAM, everything is looking good in the identity management world, but the viewpoint of how's the attacker going to attack that identity management, and what are the things that identity management isn't telling you. So whether it's shadow admins, whether it's local admins that have somehow found their way onto an endpoint, potentially outside of the purvey of identity management, all these things that we're doing are intended to make that identity management better, by giving you an additional purvey into what's going on in your environment.
All right. I think that's all the time we have for today. So thank you, Michael. Thank you, Rick. Appreciate you being with us today. And it looks like we've covered most of our questions too. And if we didn't get to yours, we'll make sure to contact you after the webinar and get an answer. Thanks to everyone on the panel. Thanks to everyone who attended. As mentioned earlier, we're going to be emailing you a copy of the session afterwards. And our series of webinars on the new normal continues next Thursday, May 7th at 11 o'clock Eastern Daylight Time with Outside Looking In, How to Stop the Rapid Rise of Insider Threats. That'll be a presentation by our field CTO, Wade Lance, and ex-CISO at City National Bank, Carl Mattson. And they're going to talk about how to protect against the spike in insider threats we have seen since the new normal has dominated our lives. You can find the registration link on the Elusive Networks events page and also at webinars.securityboulevard.com, how to stop the rapid rise of insider threats. So please stay safe, everyone, and we'll see you then. Have a good day.